Welcome to Echoes of Holmes, where secrets wait in the shadows. A brilliant mind steps into a dark puzzle. Sherlock Holmes and the mystery of the golden labyrinth. Who can be trusted when every clue hides a deeper truth? Light a candle, get comfortable, and let the mystery begin. The village of Elmstead, nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, was not the sort of place where one expected trouble. Its thatched cottages, flower-laden gardens, and narrow winding lanes gave the impression that the world's sorrows had been carefully kept at bay. Life here moved with a gentle rhythm, punctuated by the occasional fete or harvest festival, events that united the villagers in amiable harmony, or at least the semblance of it. On a particularly warm afternoon in early June, the village's gentle tranquillity was to be punctuated by a most anticipated event, Lady Winifred Ashcombe's annual garden party. Known for her impeccable taste and flair for the dramatic, Lady Winifred had spared no effort in ensuring that this year's gathering would surpass all others. White tents fluttered in the breeze, tables groaned under the weight of silver tea sets and crystal bowls of strawberries, and a string quartet played a delicate, lilting melody near the flower beds. Miss Marple, a small figure shaded beneath a wide-brimmed hat, ambled along the garden path with her usual unhurried curiosity. She had received a polite invitation weeks before, though she often attended simply to observe the interactions of her neighbours. Today, as always, she was content to listen more than to speak, to watch more than to interfere. Yet Miss Marple had learned over the years that the quietest gatherings often concealed the most telling revelations. As she passed the rose garden, she noted with faint amusement the bustling activity of the villagers. Mrs. Hartnell, the head of the local sewing circle, was whispering earnestly to Mrs. Finch, who appeared on the verge of tears over some imagined slight. Nearby, young Edward Brackley attempted to impress Miss Lottie Cooper with tales of his recent adventures in London, completely oblivious to the eye-rolls of her elder sister. In Elmstead, even small gestures spoke volumes, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes took them all in. Then, as the afternoon sun reached its zenith, the serene atmosphere was shattered by a scream, a high, piercing sound that silenced the quartet and sent teacups rattling on their saucers. The guests turned to find Lady Winifred herself, standing at the edge of the hedge maze, her hands clasped to her chest, staring down at something on the ground. It was Mr. Reginald Ashcombe, Lady Winifred's distant cousin, lying motionless amid the peonies. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an expression of frozen shock. A small, ornate letter-opener, once a decorative piece on Lady Winifred's writing desk, protruded grotesquely from his chest. The tranquil garden, bathed in sunlight moments before, had transformed into a scene of chilling horror. Miss Marple, observing calmly from the shade, made a silent note of the reactions around her. Some guests screamed or fainted, others clutched their pearls and whispered prayers. Yet one detail, seemingly insignificant to everyone else, caught her eye. A single, slightly crumpled garden glove lying a few feet from the body, as if dropped in a hurried retreat. Its owner, Miss Marple suspected, would not be far away. In that instant, Elmstead's picturesque calm vanished, replaced by a whispering unease that would not soon fade. A murder had come to their quiet village, and beneath the polite veneer of shock and grief, secrets long buried and carefully tended were poised to surface. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and stepped closer, her eyes following the small disturbances in the garden. "Well," she murmured under her breath, "let us see what stories these good people are hiding." The news of Mr. Reginald Ashcombe's sudden and violent demise spread through Elmstead like wildfire, carrying on whispers, hushed calls, and hurried footsteps. By the time the first constable arrived, summoned by the trembling hand of Mrs. Hartnell, nearly every household had been alerted in one way or another. Windows opened, curtains twitched, and the village that had known so many ordinary afternoons now found itself simmering with unease. At the Ashcombe estate, Lady Winifred stood in her drawing-room, hands clasped around a delicate lace handkerchief, eyes red from either shock or the beginnings of tears. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, flitted about, attempting to maintain order and failing spectacularly. The drawing-room smelled faintly of lavender polish and the sharp tang of fear, a combination Miss Marple had long since learned to interpret in others' behaviour. Outside, groups of villagers gathered on the estate lawn, exchanging conjectures with an eagerness that bordered on glee. Mrs. Finch, still clutching a handkerchief to her mouth, whispered dramatically to Mrs. Hartnell, "I always said something terrible would happen when Reginald came back to Elmstead. He was far too arrogant for a quiet village like ours." "Indeed," replied Mrs. Hartnell, nodding sagely. "And have you noticed how he looked at the new vicar's wife yesterday? Quite inappropriate, if you ask me. I shouldn't wonder if jealousy had something to do with it." Nearby, Edward Brackley leaned conspiratorially toward his friend Tom Weatherby, recounting, "I heard from the London papers that Reginald had been mixed up in some very unpleasant business. Diamonds, gambling, debts, apparently the sort of thing that could get a man killed." Tom whistled low. "In Elmstead, can't imagine. It's far too quiet for that sort of nonsense." Miss Marple, who had stationed herself at the edge of the gathering, listened quietly. The murmur of gossip was, to her, a kind of social map. Every word, every assumption, every dramatic inference offered insight into the villager's character and, indirectly, the puzzle before her. She observed carefully as a young woman in a lavender dress tried to maintain a composed exterior, only to glance repeatedly toward the hedge maze where the tragedy had occurred. That was Lottie Cooper, Edward's companion of the afternoon, and Miss Marple noted the shadow of anxiety that flickered across her face in a fleeting, telling detail. The constable, a serious young man with a sharp part in his hair, arrived with an assistant and immediately began cataloguing the scene. "Everyone must remain calm," he said, voice firm but edged with the faint tremor of uncertainty that comes from facing an unprecedented crime. "No one leaves until I have spoken to each person present at the time of the incident." This proclamation only seemed to heighten the excitement. Villagers whispered and darted glances at one another, some with relief that order had arrived, others with the thrill of knowing they might be called upon to provide crucial testimony. Miss Marple noted, with her usual quiet amusement, the slight stiffening of posture in those who had something to hide, as opposed to those who were merely embarrassed by their own eagerness to gossip. Lady Winifred was summoned to recount her discovery of her cousin's body. She described the scene in a trembling voice, emphasizing the horror of finding him lying amid the peonies and the grotesque intrusion of the ornate letter-opener. "Oh, it was terrible," she said, her hands wringing the lace handkerchief. One moment all was serene and bright, and the next it was as if the garden itself had conspired against us. Her words elicited sympathetic nods, though Miss Marple, listening discreetly from her chair by the window, noticed a subtle inconsistency. Lady Winifred's eyes did not linger on the letter-opener, the instrument of the crime, in the way one might expect of someone in genuine shock. Instead, her gaze repeatedly shifted toward the side entrance, where the hedge maze could be glimpsed. A minor detail, but Miss Marple filed it away in the quiet recesses of her mind. As the afternoon waned, the villagers began to share their theories with one another in clusters. Mr. Harris, the local grocer, proposed with dramatic certainty that the murderer must be someone from outside Elmstead. "No one here could harbour such malice," he said, though the sharpness in his voice betrayed an undercurrent of unease. Mrs. Pritchard, ever attentive to social propriety, disagreed, whispering that domestic tensions often ran far deeper than a stranger's intrigue, hinting at a family quarrel long forgotten. Miss Marple overheard the exchange and made a small mental note of the tension between the Ashcombe cousins. Reginald, she recalled from her past observations of him during brief village visits, had a tendency to provoke irritation and resentment even in those who outwardly appeared to be affectionate. His relationships were a tangled web of polite smiles masking sharper feelings, a web she suspected now might hold the key to the present tragedy. Meanwhile, Edward Brackley, emboldened by the constable's presence, attempted to recount Reginald's rumoured exploits in London. Yes, the man had enemies, Edward declared, sweeping his arm to include all within earshot. Quite possibly someone followed him here, someone who wanted to settle a score. One cannot imagine such affairs in a quiet place like Elmstead. Yet it seems the world's troubles have a way of catching up even to the most serene villages. Miss Marple, whose sharp eyes had noted Edward's habitual embellishment in conversation, made no outward comment. Instead, she observed how the villagers responded. Fear, relief, suspicion, and curiosity all mingled in their faces. Even the constables, outwardly formal, were susceptible to the same stirrings, and Miss Marple silently appreciated the advantage that such emotional currents could offer to a careful observer. By late afternoon, the garden had cleared, and the villagers returned to their homes with hushed tones and furtive glances. Yet the air in Elmstead remained charged with tension. Miss Marple walked slowly along the path, her hat shielding her from the sun, her mind alive with subtle patterns. The dropped glove, the anxious glances toward the maze, the inconsistent gaze of Lady Winifred all spoke to something more than the surface tragedy. Something hidden, deliberate, and carefully concealed. That evening, as twilight settled over the village and the first stars appeared, Miss Marple sat in her cosy drawing-room with a cup of tea, pondering the day's events. People, she murmured, are never quite what they seem, and a village is nothing if not a mirror of human nature. We shall see what reflections emerge when the shadows grow long. With that, she set her cup down and reached for her notebook, intending to record the minute details, the casual statements, the peculiar behaviours that might at first seem irrelevant. For in Elmstead, she had learned long ago, it was often the smallest of things that revealed the greatest truths. The following morning dawned with a quiet that felt almost unnatural. Elmstead, usually vibrant with the clatter of daily routines, seemed subdued, as if the very village itself were holding its breath. The Ashcombe estate, once a scene of leisurely garden gatherings, now bore the weight of sombre visits from constables and the occasional curious neighbour. Miss Marple, as always, observed from her comfortable vantage point in the sitting-room of her own cottage, a place that afforded her an unobtrusive view of the village path and the distant spire of St. Mary's Church. By mid-morning, the first official inquiries had begun. Inspector Harcourt, a diligent man with an air of courteous authority, arrived at the estate, accompanied by his sergeant. Their presence immediately drew the most vocal villagers, each eager to recount their version of events. Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, noted the subtle hierarchy in these interactions, the elderly and socially prominent asserting their opinions with confidence, the younger ones deferring, and a few, notably, silent, who seemed keenly aware that their own roles might come under scrutiny. Lady Winifred, still pale and frazzled, received them in the drawing-room. She recounted the discovery of her cousin's body with meticulous attention to the sequence of events, noting the exact time she had heard the scream and the path she had taken to the hedge maze. Her voice trembled slightly as she described the horror, yet Miss Marple, ever observant, noticed the way her fingers fidgeted with a small brooch, the same one she had worn to the garden party, suggesting a preoccupation with appearances, even in distress. The inspector, methodical in his questioning, turned next to the estate staff. Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, offered her testimony with precision, yet Miss Marple caught the subtle tension in her speech whenever she mentioned who had been near the hedge maze immediately before the tragedy. It was the kind of nuance most would overlook, but to Miss Marple it spoke volumes. Outside, the villagers continued their own unofficial investigations. Groups huddled in clusters, speculating on motives and alibis with the zeal of amateur detectives. Edward Brackley, puffing out his chest, proclaimed loudly to anyone within earshot that he had overheard Reginald arguing with the new vicar's wife mere days before the incident. Mrs. Finch, with dramatic flair, countered that it had surely been one of the staff, someone who had long resented Reginald's haughty manner. Miss Marple listened patiently, noting who spoke first, who deferred, and who avoided eye contact altogether. Each movement, each choice of words, revealed a hidden layer of character, and she mentally catalogued them. She was particularly attentive to Lottie Cooper, who lingered near the side entrance to the garden. Her hands twisted a handkerchief nervously, and her eyes darted toward the hedge maze more often than seemed reasonable. Miss Marple filed this observation away, sensing that the young woman's anxiety was tied less to fear of gossip than to a knowledge she had yet to reveal. By late morning, Inspector Harcourt had assembled the first batch of witness statements. A few villagers' accounts aligned neatly, while others, often contradictory, required careful cross-examination. The inspector seemed intent on focusing on the most obvious suspect, a local man known to have had a heated argument with Reginald the previous week over a minor property dispute. Yet Miss Marple, who had seen the manifold faces of human emotion and duplicity, found the choice premature. Something in the rhythm of the villagers' behaviors, in the glances exchanged and the hesitations in speech, suggested there were far subtler currents at play. Returning to her own observations, Miss Marple began a quiet stroll along the village lanes, greeting familiar faces with her usual gentle politeness. Here, too, the human landscape offered clues. Mr. Harris, the grocer, lingered by his shop, ostensibly arranging crates of apples, but clearly eager to overhear any passing conversation. Mrs. Hartnell, on the other hand, had made her way to the small bridge near the river, speaking earnestly to anyone who would listen about Reginald's temperament and possible enemies. Even the children, normally oblivious to adult affairs, skulked about in pairs, exchanging tidbits they had overheard, small truths tangled with imaginative conjectures. Miss Marple paused near the corner of the village green, where the local carpenter, Mr. Tilling, was repairing a gate. "Good morning, Mr. Tilling," she said. "How are the repairs proceeding?" The man looked up with a start, glancing briefly around as if checking that no one could overhear their conversation. "Oh, quite well, thank you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice slightly tight, "though if I may say there's something troubling about the hedge maze." Always seemed a harmless little thing, but yesterday he hesitated, then shrugged. "Perhaps it's nothing." Miss Marple noted the hesitancy, the sudden pause, and the choice of words. Nothing, she knew, is ever truly nothing. Every seemingly trivial remark was a thread, and the threads could be woven into a pattern, revealing what lay hidden beneath the ordinary facades of Elmstead. Back at the Ashcombe estate, the inspector had begun a preliminary examination of the crime scene. Constables combed the garden for fingerprints and footprints, and a medical officer had arrived to confirm the cause of death. Yet the real investigation, as Miss Marple well understood, would not be found in official reports. It would emerge from the quiet, unguarded moments, the way Lady Winifred's glance lingered on the hedge maze, the anxious twisting of Lottie Cooper's hands, the subtle, nervous gestures of the household staff. These were the clues that spoke of motive, opportunity, and hidden intentions. By afternoon, the village seemed to have entered a cautious rhythm. Residents moved about in a tentative order, tending to errands, exchanging whispers in doorways, and sneaking curious glances toward the Ashcombe estate. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a notebook and a freshly brewed cup of tea, made meticulous records of these observations. The movement of people, the small inconsistencies in their stories, the tension beneath polite speech, all were pieces of a puzzle that she could see, though others could not. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across Elmstead, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. "Patience," she murmured. "Patience and attention. The truth has a habit of revealing itself to those who look and listen carefully." She sipped her tea and watched as the villagers returned to their homes, their minds, still abuzz with speculation, yet blissfully unaware that every word, every gesture was quietly catalogued by the keen eye of the old lady in the corner. The first day of investigation had concluded, yet the mystery was far from resolved. Miss Marple knew that the layers of human behaviour, like the intricate paths of the village hedge maze, would take time to navigate, and somewhere within those layers, hidden behind politeness and fear, lay the answer to the murder of Reginald Ashcombe. By the morning following the first day of investigation, Elmstead had settled into an uneasy routine. The village, normally so serene, was now punctuated by hushed conversations and furtive glances, each person weighing what could be safely said and what must remain unspoken. The Ashcombe estate, under the constant supervision of Inspector Harcourt and his assistants, became a focal point of nervous energy. Windows were opened to let in air, though the scent of flowers could not mask the lingering aura of fear. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly among the villagers. Her steps were unhurried, her expressions neutral, yet she absorbed every detail with the acuity of a hawk observing its prey. On her way to the small post office, she noted the unusual solemnity in the villagers' faces. Mr. Harris, the grocer, who often greeted her with a cheerful nod, now murmured a distracted greeting, his eyes flicking toward the Ashcombe estate as though expecting someone to appear at the gate. Mrs. Hartnell, clutching a basket of eggs, whispered to the postmistress about the unforgivable behaviour of Reginald Ashcombe, though her voice was tinged with fear as much as indignation. In the drawing-room of the Ashcombe estate, Inspector Harcourt was poring over witness statements, each carefully transcribed into neat, ordered files. "We have several persons of interest," he announced to the constables, beginning with those closest to the victim. Lady Winifred sat quietly in her chair, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She appeared fragile, a picture of grief. Yet Miss Marple had long since learned that such appearances could conceal an astonishing amount of resolve. The inspector turned first to the household staff, questioning Mrs. Pritchard and the kitchen maid Anne about their whereabouts and any unusual observations. Every answer, meticulously recorded, was weighed against others for consistency. From the staff, attention soon turned to the wider circle of acquaintances. Edward Brackley, with his habitual flair for dramatics, was summoned. He recounted his version of events at the garden party, embellishing minor details with a flair he seemed to find irresistible. Yet even in his exaggeration, Miss Marple detected a certain nervousness, tiny hesitations before he named certain individuals, subtle glances toward the hedge maze. "It seems he was particularly close to Reginald," Edward added, lowering his voice, though perhaps not in the way most would expect. "There were disagreements, some financial, some personal, but always, I thought, beneath the surface." Lottie Cooper was questioned next. Her hands trembled slightly as she recounted her afternoon at the garden party. She claimed to have spent much of her time near the flower beds, observing the arrangements and helping Mrs. Hartnell with the tea. Yet Miss Marple, noticing the restless twisting of her handkerchief and the repeated glances toward the hedge maze, made a mental note that Lottie's story might bear closer scrutiny. Inspector Harcourt, relying on the more obvious avenues of suspicion, focused on Mr. Barrow, a neighbour who had had a heated confrontation with Reginald over a boundary dispute just the week before the murder. He had motive, the inspector declared to the assembled staff, and opportunity. We must consider him carefully. Miss Marple, sipping her tea quietly in the corner, did not argue. The constable's reasoning was logical, if conventional. Yet as she observed Mr. from across the room, she noted small but telling details. The man's gestures were unusually careful, his eyes averted when the hedge maze was mentioned, and his speech carried a tension that suggested fear rather than guilt. To Miss Marple, these subtleties indicated not a man ready to commit murder, but a man aware that suspicion had turned his way. Meanwhile, rumours continued to ripple through Elmstead. Mrs. Finch whispered to Mrs. Hartnell that she had seen Reginald speaking in a low, intense voice to an unknown visitor in the garden the day before. "I can't imagine who it could have been," she said, wringing her hands, "but I'm certain it was something dreadful. He always had a way of drawing trouble around him." Miss Marple noted the villagers' eagerness to ascribe motive to someone outside the immediate household. It was a common tendency, she reflected, to attribute malevolence to the unknown rather than confront the uncomfortable truths close to home. And yet, some details hinted that the danger was not so distant. A small scrap of fabric caught in the hedge maze, the faint imprint of a heel on the soft earth, and the single dropped garden glove all quietly suggested a presence close to the victim at the moment of the crime. By afternoon, Miss Marple had taken a quiet walk along the village lanes, observing behaviours she knew would later prove telling. Mr. Harris, the grocer, lingered outside his shop, attempting to appear busy, but clearly listening to passing conversations. Mrs. Hartnell offered her unsolicited opinions to anyone who would listen, her voice a mix of indignation and apprehension. Even the children seemed unusually aware of adult concerns, whispering fragments of overheard words with the seriousness of conspirators. At the Ashcombe estate, the inspector continued to focus on the seemingly obvious suspect, preparing to call Mr. Barrow for more intensive questioning. The man's composure was impressive, though Miss Marple noted subtle hints of strain, a slight flinch when the hedge maze was mentioned, fingers drumming nervously against the table. It was evidence to her mind not of guilt, but of careful calculation of a difference she understood well. Returning to her cottage by dusk, Miss Marple sat by the window and reflected on the day's events. The threads of motive, opportunity, and human behaviour were beginning to take shape, though they were intertwined in complex, often misleading patterns. She sipped her tea slowly, considering each individual carefully, Lady Winifred's concerned gestures, Edward Brackley's theatrical nervousness, Lottie Cooper's restless anxiety, Mr. Barrow's disciplined tension, and the various hints of envy, fear, and resentment that the villagers had so willingly revealed. The first suspects had emerged, and the police had naturally gravitated toward the most overt possibility. Yet Miss Marple, as always, sensed the deeper currents beneath the surface. In Elmstead, as in any village, appearances were deceiving, and the truth often resided in the quietest, least noticeable details. She opened her notebook and began cataloguing behaviours, glances, and hesitations, knowing that patience, careful observation, and subtle deduction would be the keys to unravelling the mystery. As night fell over Elmstead, the village slept uneasily. Somewhere amid the familiar cottages and softly swaying trees, the answer lay hidden, waiting for a careful eye to see it. And Miss Marple, ever vigilant, was certain she would find it. The days following the initial questioning passed in a tense and measured quiet. Elmstead seemed outwardly to have resumed its gentle pace, yet the shadow of Reginald Ashcombe's murder lingered like an unshakable chill. Villagers moved carefully, eyes darting, words chosen with the precision of diplomats. Even the children, once blissfully carefree, approached their play with a muted seriousness that betrayed the unspoken awareness of a tragedy that had unsettled the village's equilibrium. Miss Marple, however, observed with an unhurried attention that contrasted sharply with the bustling anxiety around her. From the comfort of her sitting-room window, she watched the estate staff continue their routines under the scrutiny of Inspector Harcourt. The constables followed a strict schedule, recording evidence, cataloguing statements, and noting inconsistencies. But Miss Marple, as always, was more interested in the human elements, the hesitations, the glances, the tiny gestures that spoke louder than words. It was during one of her quiet afternoon walks that she noticed the first clue that had somehow escaped everyone's attention. The village lane near the hedge maze, usually pristine, bore a subtle irregularity, a small, nearly invisible indentation in the soft earth, as though a heel had pressed into it recently. At first glance it seemed insignificant, perhaps the result of ordinary movement. But Miss Marple, attuned to the quiet language of the world around her, knew better. The indentation's size and depth suggested a hurried, yet precise, passage, someone who had moved with intention, not haste, but with a careful avoidance of leaving more evidence than necessary. Returning to the Ashcombe estate, she recalled the dropped glove from the garden party, lying just a few feet from the body. One glance at the garden's layout confirmed her suspicion it was not simply an accidental loss. Whoever had worn that glove had been in close proximity to Reginald in the moments before the murder, and had fled in a direction that minimized exposure. The combination of these minor clues, a crumpled glove, a footprint, the disturbed foliage suggested a level of deliberation that, in Miss Marple's mind, contradicted the police's focus on Mr. Barrow, whose presence near the estate had been brief and easily accounted for. Meanwhile, the village continued to reveal its undercurrents. At the post office, Mrs. Hartnell whispered to the postmistress about her suspicion that Lady Winifred had always favoured Reginald above other family members. "I don't mean to suggest she had anything to do with it," she added hastily, "but one never knows how envy can grow in the shadow of affection." Miss Marple, standing nearby to post a letter, nodded politely and smiled, though inwardly she catalogued the remark. Affection, resentment, and inventions long buried often drove people to acts they would never otherwise contemplate. In the Ashcombe drawing-room, Edward Brackley's nervous energy had begun to take a more subtle form. He fidgeted with his cufflinks, glanced repeatedly toward the hedge maze, and offered inconsistent accounts of where he had been during the crucial moments of the garden party. Lottie Cooper, too, displayed a similar unease. She busied herself arranging fresh flowers, avoiding the inspector's eyes, yet every so often her gaze flickered toward the maze with a tension that spoke volumes. Miss Marple, during a quiet visit to the estate under the pretence of returning Lady Winifred's gratitude for the garden party invitation, took careful note of these behaviours. She wandered slowly through the garden, her eyes scanning every detail on the neatly trimmed hedges, the scattered petals, the disturbed soil near the peonies. It was there she observed something others had overlooked entirely. A faint smudge of mud on the corner of the letter opener's handle, nearly invisible unless one knelt and examined it closely. To the casual observer it was nothing, but to Miss Marple it suggested handling carefully, deliberately, and perhaps not entirely consistent with the actions of someone rushing away from a crime scene. Later that afternoon, she sat in her cottage with a cup of tea, reviewing her notes. The footprints, the glove, the misplaced smudge, and the subtle inconsistencies in the testimonies of Edward, Brackley and Lottie Cooper began to form a pattern. It was a web of human behaviour, not forensic certainty, that pointed towards someone who had planned carefully, acted decisively, and maintained an appearance of innocence. She recalled a fleeting detail from the garden party, the conversation near the rose garden between Lady Winifred and a visiting acquaintance, a brief exchange that had seemed trivial at the time. Lady Winifred's eyes had flickered toward Reginald with a mixture of concern and something subtler, an almost imperceptible shadow of irritation. Such moments, Miss Marple knew, often contained more truth than the most dramatic declarations. By evening, the village had grown quiet again, though not all returned to rest. Mrs. Finch sat by her window, staring pensively at the Ashcombe estate, muttering speculations that ranged from the absurd to the plausible. The children whispered among themselves about shadows and secrets. Mr. Barrow, now formally questioned, maintained his calm demeanour, yet the careful observer would have noticed the subtle strain in his postural strain, born not of guilt, but of the knowledge that suspicion could linger unjustly. Miss Marple, seated comfortably by her window, took one last look at the faint traces in the garden as twilight deepened. The human landscape was revealing itself slowly. Small hesitations, subtle gestures, minor inconsistencies in behaviour. All were clues, and all required careful patience to interpret correctly. The smallest things, she murmured to herself, often carry the heaviest weight. One must simply know where to look and how to see. She sipped her tea, the warmth spreading a quiet comfort, and prepared herself for the days ahead. Somewhere among the villagers, the truth waited, and Miss Marple knew that by observing, listening, and piecing together these hidden details, the path to the murderer would eventually become clear. The morning air in Elmstead carried a peculiar stillness, as though the village itself were bracing for revelations yet to come. Birds chirped faintly among the trees, their songs oddly muted against the undercurrent of unease. Miss Marple, walking along the narrow lane toward the Ashcombe estate, noted that even the familiar scent of honeysuckle and damp earth seemed to carry a subtle tension, as if the countryside shared in the villagers' apprehension. At the estate, the day began with a renewed round of interviews, this time focusing on personal histories and relationships that might illuminate hidden motives. Inspector Harcourt, organised and meticulous, pursued what he deemed the most pressing leads, yet Miss Marple observed that his focus often overlooked nuances in behaviour that betrayed deeper truths. Lady Winifred, in her drawing-room, was the first to be questioned. "It is difficult," she said, her voice wavering, "to know what Reginald truly felt, or what others might have felt toward him. We were, after all, family, yet even within families, resentments can fester quietly." Her hands fluttered nervously over the lace of her handkerchief, and Miss Marple noted the micro-expressions that suggested both affection and irritation. In her mind, the possibility that hidden tensions had played a role in Reginald's fate was now increasingly plausible. Edward Brackley was summoned to discuss past interactions with the victim. He could be charming when he wished, yes, but he had a way of stirring discontent, Edward admitted, fidgeting with his sleeve. I dare say he enjoyed creating minor quarrels just to see the results, but nothing that would warrant such a tragedy. His glance, however, flicked toward the hedge maze, betraying a subtle anxiety. Miss Marple made careful note Edward's nervousness suggested knowledge beyond simple observation, yet the evidence was indirect, resting on behaviour rather than confession. Lottie Cooper, meanwhile, remained in the background, her attention drawn repeatedly to the peony beds where Reginald had fallen. When questioned about her movements, she hesitated. "Tu was arranging flowers with Mrs. Hartnell," she said, voice faltering. Yet her hands twisted the hem of her dress, and her eyes betrayed a shadow of something deeper, an emotion she was unwilling, or perhaps afraid, to articulate. Miss Marple catalogued each subtle cue, knowing that time often loosened the tongue and revealed truths that fear initially concealed. The household staff, too, offered pieces of a larger puzzle. Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, reluctantly disclosed that she had overheard heated exchanges between Reginald and several villagers during the garden party, exchanges that had gone unremarked by others. He had a way of provoking those around him, she admitted softly. And sometimes people could not resist replying in kind, but I never imagined it could lead to murder. Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Pritchard's recollection was precise, yet tinged with a subtle, moralizing reflection of her own values, perhaps, but also a signal of the social pressures woven into the village fabric. Outside the estate, whispers circulated among the villagers, each revelation feeding speculation. Mr. Harris, the grocer, informed anyone who would listen that he had observed long-standing tensions between Reginald and his distant cousin, Lady Winifred. "Old rivalries," he said, lowering his voice, "can turn deadly if one is not careful. I wouldn't trust appearances alone." Mrs. Finch nodded in agreement, adding her own theory that jealousy, concealed behind politeness and smiles, had likely played a part. Miss Marple, walking quietly along the garden paths, noted these observations and, more importantly, the manner in which they were delivered. People often revealed truths unintentionally through the subtle cadence of their voice, the involuntary tightening of fingers, or the brief avoidance of direct eye contact. These small behaviors, she reflected, were far more telling than any overt statement or accusation. Later that afternoon, a private conversation between Lady Winifred and Miss Marple offered further illumination. Reginald could be trying at times to assert his position, Lady Winifred confided, her voice dropping to a near whisper. And yet there were others who had grievances with him, long-standing ones. "I did not think anyone would act so rashly." Miss Marple, as ever, listened attentively, noting not only the content, but the emotion behind the words. The interplay of affection, fear, and subtle reproach hinted at complicated interpersonal dynamics, each with the potential to lead to a fatal outcome. That evening, Edward Brackley visited Miss Marple under the pretext of delivering a message from Lady Winifred. His nervous energy, previously dispersed across multiple interactions, now coalesced into something more controlled, though no less revealing. "I cannot imagine who would commit such an act," he said, trying to maintain composure. "But there are tensions, yes, tensions I did not fully appreciate until now." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the fleeting flicker of unease as he mentioned the hedge maze, a subtle signal that would have gone unnoticed by most. Throughout the day, minor quarrels and confessions surfaced among the villagers. Long-buried disputes over property boundaries, inheritance, and perceived slights emerged in snippets of conversation. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her notebook in hand, catalogued each disclosure, aware that the seemingly trivial secrets of Elmstead could coalesce into a clearer understanding of motive. Each whisper, each nervous glance, each hesitation carried weight, forming a network of interpersonal tensions as intricate as the paths of the hedge maze itself. As twilight descended, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The web of relationships surrounding Reginald Ashcombe was complex, filled with petty grievances, suppressed resentments, and subtle provocations. Yet even amid this tangle, she detected patterns who moved cautiously, who avoided scrutiny, who revealed truths without intending to. Each subtle act of human behavior brought her closer to a comprehension of the events leading to the murder. People, she mused quietly, have layers, and those layers are seldom visible until the right moment. A momentary lapse, a glance too long or too brief, a gesture unnoticed by others, these often carry the weight of truth. She sipped her tea, her thoughts settling on the intricate interplay of personality and circumstance, knowing that the puzzle of Elmstead's tragedy would yield its secrets only to patience, observation, and an understanding of the human heart. Elmstead awoke to a morning heavy with a sense of unease, one that even the early song of birds could not dissipate. The village, still recovering from the shock of Reginald Ashcombe's murder, found itself drawn into an entirely new layer of tension. Miss Marple, stepping out of her cottage and adjusting her hat against the gentle morning sun, noticed the faint tremor in the air. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Shutters opened just enough to peek, and the usual rustle of activity slowed to a cautious shuffle. By mid-morning, news had spread that the hedge maze itself had yielded an unexpected discovery. Inspector Harcourt, with his accustomed precision, announced that a small, ornate box had been found beneath a recently disturbed tuft of ivy. The box, carved with intricate patterns, was unlocked but empty, save for a single scrap of paper bearing a hastily scrawled note, "Truth lies where shadows hide." The cryptic message, though brief, immediately ignited speculation across Elmstead. Villagers whispered excitedly about secret compartments, hidden family fortunes, and coded messages, their imaginations running far beyond the facts at hand. Miss Marple, for her part, regarded the box with calm interest. It was an object of intrigue, certainly, yet she understood that its significance lay not only in what it contained or failed to contain, but in the very act of its placement. Someone had deliberately hidden it, someone who understood the layout of the maze and the importance of careful timing. The subtle evidence of intent was, in her mind, far more telling than any fanciful theories of treasure or legacy. Meanwhile, the village's first wave of gossip intensified. Mrs. Finch, speaking to Mrs. Hartnell near the post office, insisted that the box must have been planted by Reginald himself before his death. "He was fond of riddles, you know," she said with a knowing nod, "and perhaps he intended to lead someone to some secret." Mrs. Hartnell, however, shook her head emphatically. "No, no, I dare say someone wished to mislead the investigation. One cannot underestimate the cleverness of a person who wishes to remain unseen." Miss Marple, strolling along the lane toward the estate, observed the subtle interplay of reactions. Mr. Harris, the grocer, lingered near the shop, pretending to sort goods while keeping a keen eye on any passer-by. Edward Brackley, more subdued than usual, avoided the maze entirely, his eyes betraying a wariness that contrasted sharply with his previous bravado. And Lottie Cooper, whose anxious gestures Miss Marple had noted repeatedly, now seemed unusually tense, glancing toward the maze with a mixture of dread and urgency. Inside the estate, the discovery of the box prompted renewed questioning. Inspector Harcourt gathered the household staff and immediate associates of the Ashcombe family. Lady Winifred appeared composed, yet the faint crease of worry on her brow suggested she, too, felt the shift in the investigation. "A box," she murmured, "left in a place where only a few could reach it. Who could have done such a thing without being seen?" Her tone was more measured than anyone else's, but to Miss Marple it contained an unintentional hint of recognition, as though she suspected more than she was willing to admit. Edward Brackley, called upon to recount his movements again, fidgeted nervously. "I had no reason to approach the maze after the party," he insisted. Yet Miss Marple detected a subtle tension in the way he clasped his hands. Lottie Cooper's account, similarly rehearsed, contained slight inconsistencies. She claimed to have avoided the maze entirely that afternoon, yet her careful avoidance of the inspector's gaze suggested that the truth was more complicated. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the garden herself. The maze, usually a place of leisurely strolls and whimsical exploration, now seemed charged with meaning. Each turn, each corner, each shadowed alcove offered potential insight. It was here, behind a low hedge, that she noticed the faint impression of footprints, slightly larger than Lottie Cooper's, but too small for Mr. Barrow. The careful spacing suggested someone who had walked deliberately, pausing, glancing, and then moving on with calculated caution. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple noted the subtle reactions of those present. Lady Winifred's eyes, when the box was mentioned, flickered momentarily toward a small cabinet near the fireplace. Edward Brackley's nervousness deepened, and Lottie Cooper fidgeted, glancing toward the same cabinet as if aware of its relevance. The room itself became a stage upon which small, revealing gestures played out, each contributing to the puzzle that Miss Marple had been assembling over several days. Outside, the villagers speculated relentlessly. Mrs. Finch insisted that the note implied a secret relationship, perhaps an illicit friendship or a long-buried feud. Mr. Harris, ever the practical observer, suggested that someone might be attempting to redirect suspicion entirely, using the box and note as tools of deception. Both interpretations, while plausible on the surface, lacked the subtle understanding of motive and behavior that Miss Marple relied upon. By evening, the weight of the day's discoveries had settled into a quiet tension. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a cup of tea, reflected on the new development. The hidden box and its cryptic message were not random. They were deliberate, calculated, and intended to manipulate perception. Combined with the prior observations, the dropped glove, the disturbed soil, the subtle hesitations of Edward Brackley and Lottie Cooper, they hinted at a carefully orchestrated narrative designed to conceal the truth. The maze is a clever hiding place, Miss Marple mused, but it is not the maze itself that matters, it is the person who understands it well enough to use it. And someone knows far more than they wish anyone to know. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, eyes tracing the outline of the hedge from her window. The threads of observation and behavior were weaving a pattern, each detail an essential component of a puzzle whose solution required patience, discretion, and an understanding of the human heart. As darkness fell over Elmstead, a hush settled across the village. The discovery of the box had shifted the investigation, introducing new possibilities and casting doubt on previously held assumptions. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, aware that in time, with careful attention and measured observation, the true picture would reveal itself layer by layer, subtle clue by subtle clue. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows of the hedge maze or in the quiet gestures of the villagers, the murderer's hand was already moving, unaware that the patient eyes of Elmstead's most unassuming observer were upon them. The morning light filtered softly through Miss Marple's sitting-room window, casting a gentle glow over the neatly arranged tea service and the notebook that lay open on the table. Elmstead, for all its apparent calm, was a village poised on the cusp of revelation. The recent discovery of the box in the hedge maze had stirred new undercurrents, and Miss Marple knew that the next steps required delicate precision. Today, she intended to test the reactions of those most closely tied to the events, to observe how subtle prodding could reveal truths that had remained carefully concealed. Her first visit of the day was to Lady Winifred. Miss Marple arrived under the pretext of discussing arrangements for the estate's upcoming luncheon, yet every word, every pause was calculated to elicit small but telling responses. Lady Winifred greeted her warmly, though her composure was shadowed by a faint tension. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, smoothing the lace on her sleeve. "I hope you slept well after the disturbing events." "Thank you, Lady Winifred," Miss Marple replied gently, her eyes scanning the drawing room. noting the subtle disorder in the placement of cushions and paper, evidence of someone preoccupied, even anxious. "I wondered about the box you discovered in the maze yesterday. Quite a curious item, isn't it? One wonders why someone would leave such a thing in that particular spot." Lady Winifred's fingers tightened briefly around her handkerchief. "I cannot imagine, truly. It seemed as though someone wished to make a statement, though I cannot fathom whom or why." She glanced at the fireplace, a fleeting hesitation that Miss Marple filed away silently. Next, she visited Edward Brackley, who had requested to speak privately about the estate's affairs. The young man appeared nervous, fidgeting with his watch chain, and Miss Marple, noting the small tremor in his hands, decided to guide the conversation with care. "I hear you were quite attentive to the garden arrangements during the party," she began casually. "The hedge maze, too, is rather intricate. Do you often walk its paths?" Edward swallowed, his gaze flickering to the window before returning to her. I have wandered it occasionally, though never in any particular pattern," he said, attempting a casual tone. Yet the subtle avoidance of direct eye contact, the slight shift of weight from one foot to the other, all spoke to an underlying tension. Miss Marple offered no further comment, allowing a silence to settle, giving him space to reveal more than he realized. "The maze," she continued softly, "can conceal both secrets and intentions. One can see much without being observed, and yet the same paths can betray the unwary." Edward's eyes widened slightly, a micro-expression that might have passed unnoticed by anyone else. He nodded as though acknowledging a truth he could not articulate. Miss Marple noted it carefully, storing it among the many behavioural cues she had gathered over the days. Her attention then turned to Lottie Cooper. The young woman, usually demure, seemed unusually alert, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Marple engaged her in conversation about the flowers and the estate's upcoming events, weaving gentle questions about timing and movement during the garden party into the discussion. "I noticed, Lottie," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile, "that you spent considerable time arranging the peonies. Quite a meticulous task, I imagine. Did you find yourself near the hedge maze at any point?" Lottie's fingers twitched and her eyes darted momentarily to the window. "I stayed mostly with the flowers," she said softly, her voice faltering. Yet the hesitation, the subtle shift in posture, spoke to an unspoken truth. Miss Marple recorded these nuances, aware that fear often manifests in the smallest involuntary gestures. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had orchestrated her inquiries with careful precision. She allowed observations to accumulate like gentle ripples, avoiding direct accusations while gauging reactions to hypothetical scenarios and casual remarks. In the drawing-room of the Ashcombe estate, she brought together Lady Winifred, Edward Brackley, and Lottie Cooper under the guise of discussing garden arrangements for an upcoming village event. "As we consider the new hedge paths," Miss Marple remarked, "one cannot help but reflect on how easily a person might move unnoticed. The maze, though designed for leisure, offers many places to pause, to hide, or even to linger with intentions unseen. It makes one think about how careful planning can obscure more than just footsteps." The statement was innocuous enough on the surface, yet each of her companions reacted in a manner uniquely revealing. Lady Winifred's gaze lingered on the cabinet near the fireplace. Edward's fingers twitched nervously, and Lottie's eyes flickered toward the maze, darting away as though she feared acknowledgement. These responses, subtle and unconscious, were far more illuminating than any direct questioning could achieve. Miss Marple continued her careful probing throughout the afternoon, varying topics, tone and focus to draw out minute behaviours. She observed how each individual responded to casual mentions of the garden, party, the peony beds, the hedge maze, and even the empty box. The combination of hesitation, micro-expressions, and body language painted a more detailed portrait of involvement than statements alone ever could. By early evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind filled with the day's intricate observations. The villagers' interactions, each carefully documented in her notebook, formed an invisible web of tension, deception, and subtle revelation. She sipped her tea, reflecting on the responses she had observed. Edward's nervousness, Lottie's fleeting admissions, Lady Winifred's almost imperceptible cues, all were threads in a larger tapestry. "Patience," she murmured, "and careful attention to the smallest reactions. That is how one uncovers truths hidden beneath polite words and well-rehearsed stories." She placed her cup down, her mind already tracing the connections between gestures, glances, and moments of hesitation. Outside, Elmstead fell into a tranquil hush, though the undercurrent of unease remained. Somewhere among the estate and the surrounding village, the murderer watched, unaware that the observant eyes of Miss Marple had begun to piece together the subtle pattern of their deception. The stage was set for the final unravelling, and Miss Marple knew that only a delicate and well-timed revelation would illuminate the truth fully. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elmstead, giving the village an almost ethereal quality as Miss Marple walked calmly toward the Ashcombe estate. The day's light highlighted the gentle undulations of the garden, the carefully trimmed hedges, and the quiet serenity that masked a tangled web of human emotions. She carried with her only a notebook, her sharp eyes, and the careful observations collected over many days. Today, she intended to bring clarity to the confusion that had enveloped the village since the shocking events of the garden party. Inside the drawing-room, the key figures had gathered Lady Winifred, Edward Brackley, and Lottie Cooper. Each appeared composed, though subtle signs of tension betrayed their awareness of the gravity of the conversation. Inspector Harcourt, though respectful of Miss Marple's insights, stood slightly to one side, eager yet cautious, as he prepared to witness the culmination of the investigation. Miss Marple began in her gentle, unassuming manner, speaking as though merely sharing reflections. "It has been a most interesting series of days," she remarked softly. "One cannot help but notice how people reveal themselves in small, almost imperceptible ways. A hesitation here, a glance there, an action that seems inconsequential at the moment, all these pieces together form a larger picture." The trio nodded politely, Lady Winifred adjusting her lace handkerchief, Edward Brackley fidgeting slightly with his cufflinks, and Lottie Cooper casting furtive glances toward the window. Miss Marple continued, her tone unwavering. "Let us begin with the glove found near the peonies. A single, crumpled glove, easily overlooked, yet unmistakable in its indication that someone had been near Reginald at the crucial moment. The glove, together with the footprints I observed in the soil and the subtle disturbance of the foliage, suggested deliberate and calculated movement within the hedge maze. It was not a frantic act, it was careful, measured, and intended to mislead the casual observer. She allowed the words to hang in the air, observing the reactions carefully. Edward's fingers twitched Lottie's gaze, and Lady Winifred's eyes shifted ever so slightly toward the cabinet near the fireplace. Each response, small yet telling, confirmed what Miss Marple had long suspected: the truth was closer to home than many wished to admit. Now, she continued, considering the ornate box discovered yesterday. Its placement, empty, yet accompanied by a cryptic note, was designed to attract attention and distract from the more subtle elements of the crime. The note's suggestion that the truth lay where shadows hide was a clever misdirection. One is led to look outward, towards secrets of others, while the real act occurred within immediate reach of the victim and those surrounding him. Her gaze settled on Lottie Cooper, whose hands had begun to fidget in small, almost imperceptible ways. "Lottie, your nervousness has not escaped notice," Miss Marple said gently. "Your eyes repeatedly sought the hedge maze. Your posture shifted when certain topics arose, and yet your verbal account remained consistent only because it lacked details one might expect from someone directly involved." Lottie's face paled, and her lips parted as though to speak, but she found herself momentarily silent. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. They were calm, patient, and filled with a quiet authority that brooked no deception. "Edward Brackley," she continued, her tone measured and even, "your anxiety, your nervous gestures, and your instinctive avoidance of the maze's discussion have been observed with equal clarity. You possess knowledge, yes, but knowledge alone does not implicate you unless joined by the evidence of action. And it is in the subtle, unnoticed behaviors where action often speaks louder than words." The inspector shifted slightly, his interest piqued, but Miss Marple allowed her own observations to unfold naturally. She stepped closer to the fireplace, indicating the small cabinet that had drawn Lady Winifred's gaze on multiple occasions. "Lady Winifred," she said softly, "it is not my intention to accuse prematurely, yet certain behaviors cannot be ignored. Your eyes, your hand movements, your careful attention to the placement of the box and the letter opener all suggest a familiarity with the scene that only someone closely involved would possess." Lady Winifred drew in a sharp breath, her hands gripping the lace handkerchief tightly. She began, then faltered. Miss Marple's eyes, serene and unflinching, held hers patiently. "Go on," she urged gently. The confession came in quiet, measured words. Lady Winifred admitted that the confrontation with her cousin had escalated unexpectedly. A minor argument, long simmering resentments, and a sudden loss of temper had combined in a fatal moment. The glove, the careful steps in the maze, and the placement of the box were all part of a subconscious effort to conceal involvement, yet the subtle signals of human behavior, tension, hesitation, and gaze had betrayed the truth. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, allowing a moment for the gravity of the revelation to settle. "It is a sorrowful matter indeed," she said gently. "Yet the truth is often revealed not through overt acts or dramatic displays, but through the quiet, unconscious behaviors that accompany our intentions. Each of you, whether through observation or misunderstanding, contributed pieces to this puzzle, but the decisive thread lay in the human heart, its small signals, and the choices made in a moment of intense emotion." Inspector Harcourt, though professional, could not hide a mixture of relief and astonishment. The meticulous weaving together of minor details, subtle behaviors, and carefully observed patterns had led Miss Marple to a truth that had eluded conventional investigation. Lottie Cooper, Edward Brackley, and even Lady Winifred herself sat quietly, the weight of understanding settling over them. Miss Marple's calm demeanour, her patience, and her unwavering attention to human nature had illuminated what had been concealed, and the village of Elmstead, for the first time since the tragedy, began to comprehend the full picture of what had transpired. As the room grew still, Miss Marple reflected internally, not with triumph, but with the quiet acknowledgement that human behaviour, in its myriad subtle forms, had once again revealed a truth hidden beneath the surface of polite society. The revelation was complete, the puzzle solved, and the intricate dance of observation, deduction, and patience had achieved its purpose. The village of Elmstead awoke to a quiet that felt almost as profound as the night itself. Though the sun rose with its usual gentle warmth, casting soft light over thatched cottages and neatly tended gardens, there lingered an air of measured restraint. The news of Lady Winifred's confession had travelled swiftly, reaching every corner of the village. The shock, while profound, was tempered by a collective understanding that the truth, though sorrowful, had finally emerged. Miss Marple, strolling along the village lane in the early morning, observed the subtle ways in which the village had shifted. Windows were open, yet the curtains were drawn just enough to shield private spaces. Villagers exchanged polite nods rather than the animated whispers that had characterized the days of speculation. Even the children, who had been acutely aware of the tension, now approached their play with careful circumspection, their voices lowered and their laughter tempered by awareness. At the Ashcombe estate, Lady Winifred maintained a composed demeanour, yet those who had known her long enough could discern a quiet sorrow in the set of her shoulders and the occasional tension in her fingers. The household staff moved with subdued efficiency, speaking only when necessary, their eyes betraying the residual anxiety of witnessing events that had forever altered the rhythm of their daily routines. Miss Marple spent the morning conversing with the villagers under the guise of routine errands. At the post office, she found Mrs. Hartnell arranging parcels while murmuring reflections on the nature of resentment and miscommunication. "One never realizes," Mrs. Hartnell remarked, "how much tension can lie beneath polite smiles and careful speech. It is extraordinary what might drive a person to extremes." Miss Marple smiled softly and nodded, allowing the remark to deepen her understanding of the village psyche. Nearby, Edward Brackley lingered outside the grocer's shop, appearing contemplative and subdued. His nervous energy, once a defining feature, had given way to a measured, almost reflective demeanour. Miss Marple observed him discreetly, noting the subtle shift in posture and expression. He had learned, perhaps belatedly, the weight of human emotion and the consequences of underestimating the complexity of relationships and intentions. Lottie Cooper, too, moved with quiet deliberation through the village lanes. Her glances toward the hedge maze were no longer tinged with fear, but with thoughtful reflection, as if she were retracing the paths of past events in her mind. Miss Marple, noticing these details, understood that the experience had imparted a profound lesson in awareness, caution, and the subtle dynamics of human behaviour. Throughout the morning, Miss Marple visited the Ashcombe estate under the pretence of assisting with garden arrangements, yet she took careful note of the ongoing routines. The peonies, once the setting of a tragic confrontation, were now tended with deliberate care. The paths of the hedge maze, which had concealed both secrets and subtle movements, were swept and inspected as though to reclaim them from the shadow of past events. The estate itself, while restored to outward order, retained the faint residue of human tension that no amount of tidying could erase entirely. By midday, the inspector had completed his formal investigation and left Elmstead with his notes and reports. His respect for Miss Marple's insight was apparent in the way he lingered briefly at the estate gate, acknowledging her contribution to resolving a case that had confounded conventional methods. Villagers, too, seemed to recognize the subtle authority of the old lady who had observed, listened, and deduced with quiet precision, her reputation growing even as she herself remained unassuming. Miss Marple spent the afternoon walking among the flower beds, her eyes lingering on the small disturbances in the soil, the faint traces of human presence and the subtle signs of anxiety now dissipating among the household staff. She reflected on the nature of human behaviour, on the delicate interplay of emotion, intention, and circumstance that had led to the tragic events. In Elmstead, as she had observed countless times, human motives were rarely straightforward. Resentment, jealousy, and suppressed emotions often lay hidden beneath layers of civility, revealing themselves only in fleeting gestures, slight hesitations, and involuntary reactions. Lady Winifred, speaking quietly to Miss Marple in the late afternoon, expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It is a dreadful burden," she said softly, "to acknowledge one's actions even when unintentional, and yet there is a strange comfort in the knowledge that the truth is known, even if it is painful." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle. "Truth," she observed, "has a way of revealing itself in its own time. One only needs the patience to recognize the signs and the courage to interpret them carefully." The villagers, too, began to reconcile with the aftermath in their own ways. Conversations were less animated, more reflective. The petty quarrels and speculative theories that had flourished in the days following the murder gave way to cautious understanding. Even the children, sensing the collective mood, engaged in their games with a subdued but persistent curiosity, their questions now tempered with a nascent comprehension of the complexity of adult actions and intentions. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, carrying with her the calm satisfaction of a case meticulously observed and patiently unravelled. She seated herself by the window with a cup of tea, watching the last rays of sunlight illuminate the gentle contours of the village. Elmstead, though forever altered by the tragic events, had begun to resume its quiet rhythms, and the subtle order of life returned once more. Reflecting on the sequence of events, Miss Marple mused on the nature of human behaviour and the intricate networks of relationships that shape our actions. She considered how small gestures, seemingly trivial observations, and the delicate art of attention to detail had revealed a truth that was hidden in plain sight. Patience, careful observation, and an understanding of human nature, she knew, were far more potent tools than speculation or force. As night fell over Elmstead, the village lay in a gentle hush, its cottages and gardens cloaked in the calm of evening. The events of the garden party, the hedge maze, and the concealed box had left an indelible mark on its residents, yet life continued with the quiet resilience of a place accustomed to the ebb and flow of human emotion. Miss Marple, seated in her chair by the window, took a final sip of tea and reflected with serene clarity. "Human nature is a labyrinth of its own," she murmured. "The paths are winding, the shadows deep, and the smallest gestures often reveal what the loudest words conceal. In the end, it is not force or fear that uncovers truth, but careful attention, gentle patience, and the willingness to see beyond appearances." With that thought, she placed her cup down and allowed herself to watch the stars emerge over Elmstead, confident that though the village had witnessed tragedy, it had also seen the quiet triumph of insight, observation, and the enduring clarity of human understanding.